Welcome back to the Curbsiders. I'm Dr. Matthew Frank Watto, here with my great friend and America's primary care physician, Dr. Paul Nelson Williams. We're about to drop some knowledge on IBS, Paul. Is that right?
Yeah, we're talking about IBS tonight.
Yeah. So, Paul, I think most people know that IBS is, when people are having recurrent abdominal pain, a change in their stool, and it can be diarrhea, constipation, or both. And Paul, what kind of workup do we need to do for this? I mean, we talked about in a previous video how most of the time in these disorders of gut-brain interaction, which IBS is one of them, your testing is going to be negative, and we expect it to be negative. But what testing are we going to do? Let's say someone has IBS-D.
Yeah, if we're looking at the diarrheal predominant type, I think we talked to Dr. Wang and she went through what she does, and it's actually not that different than I think what most primary care doctors would do. You don't want to miss the obvious stuff first and just jump right to the diagnosis. So it's worthwhile to review their medications to make sure there's no causative etiology, there's not some sneaky metformin causing problems or what have you. Certainly want to make sure they have thyroid testing on board so that you're not missing that as a diarrheal cause. Thinking about the causes of malabsorption, so if they've had previous gut surgery of some kind, or they've had a cholecystectomy, like it's worth sort of exploring possible causative etiologies before jumping right to IBS-D. And then she does often test for celiac disease with serologies, may do a fecal calprotectin in the right patients to see if we're working with an inflammatory bowel disease potentially. And then in patients that warranted, like say they are avid campers or are drinking, I don't know, mud puddles in the city or have risk for C. diff exposure, like those patients you'll do more sort of guided testing. But it's really a fairly broad initial workup in the absence of something pointing in a specific direction, which I think is what we should all feel fairly comfortable doing in the first place.
Fortunately, you don't have to mess around with like 48-hour stool collections for bile acids and fat and things like that. Let the GI doctors do that. And so it's a pretty basic workup that you can definitely send off in primary care. If they have the constipation type, it's even easier. I mean, you pretty much look for, is there any obvious cause? Like, is there anything going on metabolically, or are there any medications that are causing constipation? And if you don't find anything, I mean, really, all you have to do is a trial of laxatives. Of course, make sure they're up to date. Like if they're due for colon cancer screening, make sure you screen them for colon cancer. But otherwise, you don't have to do much. And if a trial of laxatives goes bad, they might see GI and get some of the motility testing like anal manometry and things like that. But it's not really necessary for most people.
Yeah.
And Dr. Wang actually mentioned too that she always asks about like incomplete emptying and having to strain and things like that, because some of those people have dyssynergy of their muscles in their pelvis, and that can be worked on. And she prescribes everyone a squatty potty if they have that, she said.
She was a big fan of the public physical therapy, which would help a lot of people, and is not one more med to add onto the list too.
Yeah. So the treatments for IBS, one of the treatments that unfortunately is not widely available, but hopefully will be sort of like online, the online versions will pop up that are good and evidence-based, but gut-directed CBT or gut-directed hypnotherapy actually have a number needed to treat as low as 4, Paul, which is just crazy. But of course, they're going to be difficult to access. So in primary care, Paul, if we're recommending a FODMAP diet to somebody, should we just start the FODMAP diet? This is a good thing to remain on for the rest of your life. Is that a good way to go?
Yeah, just set it and forget it. You just tell them to restrict themselves endlessly and then just never go back. No, it's the point that Dr. Wang made is that the FODMAP it's a short-term thing. Like you don't have patients on FODMAP endlessly, like 6 weeks is the number that she gave us. And then you start reintroducing food back into the diet. And that's a really key element because if you do not do that, then you can lead to micronutrient deficiencies, which is bad. Or even you can actually develop food intolerances as a result of this FODMAP diet, which is even worse. You've just exacerbated the problem. So the FODMAP diet is not to be a permanent diet. It is a way to kind of help figure out sort of what's bothering you, what's not, and make sure that you're actually heading down the right diagnostic path.
Yeah. So what in primary care, Paul, why is it important for us? Let's say someone has IBS-C. Why is it important for us to treat that constipation? How does that help the bowel?
Yeah, it's the things that struck me about talking to Dr. Wang is just how much of this has to do with stretch. And you have these muscular layers that are sort of being stretched out, and that can be very irritative to certain people. They're hypersensitive to that. They're sensing that. That's one of the reasons why they're so uncomfortable. And so it makes great sense to actually treat constipation really aggressively to decrease that stress, keep things moving along so that you don't have that kind of constant irritation. And it's the stuff, again, things that we in primary care should be reasonably comfortable doing. So there's the old standards. But if you wanted, you can sort of do the more specialized medications of things like your psylliums and your polyethylene glycols are not doing it, then you can do things like lubiprostone or linaclotide, which I reach for less, but are certainly available at the primary care level. You don't have to wait for a GI doctor to do necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And if it's on the opposite side of things, if someone has IBS with diarrhea and they're having a flare, she mentioned she tells them to schedule loperamide, not to take it as needed because, once they're in the middle of a flare, just schedule it, keep it in your system to slow things down. Otherwise you're constantly playing catch up if you're just taking PRN doses. And then for global symptoms of IBS, peppermint oil works, as we mentioned in a previous video. Make sure they're not taking the essential oil that's meant for a diffuser, but there are peppermint oil products that you can buy that are meant for IBS, or they can do peppermint tea, as we said. And then, of course, TCAs do have some good evidence that they work in IBS as well. And the newer generations ones like nortriptyline or disipramine are the ones that would be preferred. So we got into so much on this episode with Dr. Iris Wang. So you can click on the link in the episode transcript below if you're interested to hear the whole thing, and I would highly recommend it. But with all that, until next time, I've been Dr. Matthew Frank Watto, and this has been another episode of the Curbsiders, bringing you a little knowledge food for your brain hole.
And I remain Dr. Paul Nelson Williams. Thank you and goodbye.